This story happened to me not so long ago, but the memories of it still haunt me. It all started, oddly enough, with curiosity, a simple, banal interest in something that has long been forgotten and hidden from prying eyes. I've never been someone who believes in the supernatural or is scared of urban mythology, but what I learned and saw then changed my perception of the world forever. We are talking about an abandoned shelter on the outskirts of our city. There were a lot of rumors about him, most of which seemed to me to be typical horror stories for teenagers. It was said that secret experiments were conducted there, that people disappeared without a trace, that even the police avoided this place. I listened to all this with mockery, but at some point I decided that I needed to find out the truth. I work as a journalist, and my job is often related to such investigations. But this story was special. It seemed that everything I had done before was just preparation for the real task. So I packed everything I needed: flashlight, a dictaphone, a camera, and set off on the very night that turned my life around. When I got to the old fence surrounding the shelter, I stopped the car and looked around carefully. The place looked so abandoned that it seemed as if it had been forgotten for centuries. The fence was rusty, almost collapsed, but it still inspired an ominous feeling. Away from the city, in complete silence, I suddenly realized that no one would even know if something happened to me. The light of the flashlight picked out old walls, covered with mold and dirt from the darkness. The entrance was open, a massive metal door that seemed to be too heavy for time itself to open. A strange feeling did not leave me. Everything looked as if someone had recently been here. Inside the shelter, the air was suffocating and heavy. Every step echoed hollowly, crashing against the concrete walls. The corridors leading deep into the building resembled a maze from which there was no exit. I walked slowly, looking around, trying to memorize every detail. Dust covered everything around, and mold corroded the walls and floors. The first thing I noticed was that some of the rooms had clearly been used recently. There were torn sheets of paper on the floor, among which I found documents and notes in a language unknown to me. These scraps of paper looked like they had been left in a hurry. In one of the documents, I came across something like a map, where different parts of the building were marked. With every step I took, I felt the anxiety inside me increase. But I kept going on, carried away by some unknown inner feeling. I moved along the corridor, trying to ignore the strange sounds that came from the dark corners. Sometimes I thought I heard footsteps, but when I turned around, I didn't see anyone. Sometimes I heard a sound like something metallic scraping on the concrete floor, but I convinced myself that it was just my fear playing on my imagination. At some point, I came across an old door that was different from the others. It was made of iron, with a small slit at eye level, like in the doors in prison cells. My heart started beating faster when I pulled the handle. The door opened with a long creak, and I stepped inside. The room was bigger than I expected. At first glance, it was empty, but the air here was even heavier and more unpleasant. Going a little further, I found old metal bunks lined up along the walls. There was a bundle on one of them. I cautiously came closer and unwrapped it. It was a ragged, dirty garment that had obviously been there for many years. But the strangest thing was that the clothes seemed almost new, as if someone had just left them. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and I felt like I was starting to panic. But it was too late to retreat. I picked up the camera and started taking pictures. The camera clicked silently, capturing every detail. At some point, I noticed strange marks on the wall, long, deep scratches, as if someone was trying to get out of here using only their nails. My mind frantically searched for a rational explanation, found only more questions. I continued my search and came across another door at the far end of the room. It was closed, but surprisingly not locked. Overcoming my hesitation, I opened it and entered. The room beyond the door was even darker, and apparently had not been used for a long time. The walls were covered with some kind of symbols, illegible and frightening. Various tools were scattered on the floor, obviously used for other purposes. Among them I noticed an old scalpel box, broken and rusted. It all looked like someone was trying to do something here, but dropped everything halfway, hurriedly leaving the place. But the scariest thing I found was at the very end of the room. There was an old video camera in the corner, pointing at something I couldn't see at first. As I got closer, I saw that the camera was set to record, but there was no film in it. There was an old cassette lying on the floor next to it, half out of the case. I picked it up and examined it carefully. Tape looked like it had just been used. But why was she left here? I took out a dictaphone and began recording my thoughts, describing everything I saw. At that moment, I felt uneasy, and I felt that someone was watching me. I stood in this strange room, surrounded by ominous symbols covering the walls, and felt cold sweat trickle down my spine. All these objects, left as if in a hurry, a video camera aimed at an unknown object, and an empty cassette tape. All this caused me anxiety, which was growing by the minute. Something was wrong here, but I couldn't figure out what it was. Trying to calm down, I took some pictures of the camera and the cassette, then put the cassette in my pocket. This little detail seemed to be the key to the solution. So far, I didn't know where it would lead me. Thoughts were spinning in my head about what kind of people could stay in this place. I tried to convince myself that there was nothing mystical here, that it was just an abandoned building with a dark history. But even rational explanations did not allay my fears. Slowly, I left the room and found myself back in the hallway, where the cold air, mixed with mold and dampness, chilled to the bones. It seemed that even the walls here had absorbed all the horror of what had once happened in this shelter. The walls seemed to be watching me. Some kind of oppressive atmosphere was breaking through them, which did not let me go a step. I continued down the corridor, following the map I found in one of the rooms. The map was drawn carelessly, hastily, but it pointed to several points marked with symbols that reminded me of those on the walls. I thought that these symbols might have some meaning for those who left this card, but I couldn't figure out their meaning. The corridor led me deeper and deeper into the building, to where the flashlight light was getting fainter and the shadows around me were getting thicker. The fear inside me grew by the minute, but I tried to suppress it. The rational part of my mind assured me that this was just an abandoned place, that all I could see were just traces of people who had tried to do something here, perhaps even some kind of cult or group of fanatics. But another part of my mind, the one that absorbed the atmosphere of this place, whispered that I should turn back. And so I got to another door marked on the map. It was different from all the others, massive, heavy, with several locks that someone had already opened. There were fresh scratches on the door, as if someone had tried to open it recently. I froze in front of her, hesitating before pulling the handle. The door opened with a heavy creak, and a room that seemed like a real nightmare opened up in front of me. The walls here were covered with the same symbols, but much clearer and brighter than in previous rooms. It seemed that here they were painted with special diligence, almost with ritual care. There were piles of strange objects on the floor, dolls with torn limbs, broken mirrors, old books with incomprehensible texts in a language unknown to me. I stood in front of the mirror, trying to calm my racing heart. My thoughts were racing between fear and disbelief. It's impossible, I said to myself, but how can I explain it? Fear seemed to fill everything around. I looked at the footprints on the mirror again, and suddenly they began to melt, as if disappearing right in front of my eyes. I tried to convince myself that it was all a trick of the light, that the fogged mirror and strange lines were just the result of my nervous state. But then, where did this note come from? And what did the phrase, "you don't belong here," mean? My head started to ache from the strain. I abruptly turned around and left the bathroom. As I passed the bedroom, I noticed that the door was ajar again, although I definitely remembered that I had closed it. There was some strange energy in the house, something subtly wrong, as if the very space around me was breathing and living its own life. I headed downstairs to the kitchen, feeling anxiety building in my chest. I needed to calm down, drink some water, try to put my thoughts in order. The kitchen greeted me with the cold light of a lamp, and I automatically opened the refrigerator, not even remembering why I did it. Everything was in its place inside, but I suddenly realized that I no longer feel hungry. I don't want to drink. All I needed to do was figure out what was going on. I sat down at the table and stared at one point, trying to build a logical chain of events. Who could have gotten into my house? Why didn't I hear any noise? No signs of forced entry? Could someone I know have made fun of me in this way? But even in the joke, there was nothing that could explain what was happening. Thoughts swarmed in my head, but none of them gave answers. It took several minutes before I realized that I was sitting in complete silence, except for the muffled noise from the street through the window, which I thought was closed. Got up slowly and walked over to him. The window was ajar and the cold night air entered the room through it. I felt that strange feeling of observation again, as if someone invisible was watching my every move. An inner voice kept telling me to leave the house, to get as far away as possible, but something held me back. Not fear, but rather a desire to understand. To leave now would be to give up, to admit that I can't control what's going on in my own house. I closed the window, trying not to make any noise, and returned to the table. The decision was brewing by itself. You need to inspect the house, every part of it, check the locks, windows, doors. Maybe this will help me find at least some explanation. I started going through the rooms one by one. Everything was in its place in the living room, but I noticed that the clock on the wall had stopped. Looking at them, I felt as if time had slowed down. There was a strange silence in the room, as if everything was quiet, waiting. Leaving the living room, I moved into the study. There, on the table, were the papers I had left the day before. Everything looked the same as I remembered, except for one thing. My computer mouse was shifted, as if someone had recently touched it. I sat down at my desk, turned on my computer, and saw that there was a text document on the screen that I definitely hadn't opened. There was only one word in the document: leave. This moment was a turning point for me. I realized that I couldn't stay in the house anymore. It wasn't just fear. I intuitively felt that I was in danger. I got up, turned off the computer, and hurried to the exit. I grabbed my keys, my wallet, and quickly walked out the door without looking back. Once outside, I felt relieved, but I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something was left in the house, something I couldn't fight anymore. I got in the car and just drove off. It doesn't matter where. The only important thing was to get as far away from this place as possible, and what I couldn't explain. And now, every time I remember that day, I realize that I made the right choice. The house that was once my refuge became a place where I could no longer feel safe. Instead of looking at the mannequin, I looked around the room carefully. I noticed that the threads attached to the mannequin were secured using hooks driven into the ceiling. If the mannequin was moving, then it had to be connected to a mechanism located somewhere here. From time to time, it could hook and move on its own, depending on how the weight distribution or even the slightest movement of air changed. I went to the wall, where there were several panels covered with dust and dirt. I managed to move one of the panels, and I found a small lever under it. The mechanism seemed old, but it worked well enough to demonstrate its function. When I pulled the lever, there was a screeching sound in the room, and the mannequin, which seemed so scary to me, actually turned out to be part of a mechanical system. This mechanism set the mannequin in motion, and the screeching I heard was caused by the creaking of old parts and the friction of metal on metal. I rested for a while and looked around. In another corner of the room, I noticed a wooden box that seemed to be jammed and was not an item for normal storage. I opened it and found several entries that confirmed my assumptions. The documents inside the box were reports of tests that were conducted here several decades ago. They described various experiments with mechanisms and psychological tests, but they were all largely taken out of context and torn. Apparently, it was a place to store materials related to projects that were once carried out in this shelter. I understood that all these objects, symbols, and movements of the mannequins had no mystical significance. It was an old laboratory or testing facility, abandoned in a hurry. Many of these mechanical systems and their parts may have been part of old equipment that was once used to test various hypotheses. People who worked here probably disappeared because the project was closed or postponed, and the place was left unattended. I found several more documents that said that the building was closed and all the projects were deemed impractical. All this confirmed that the shelter was just an abandoned laboratory complex that had once been the center of research activities. there was no supernatural force here. After collecting all my finds and documents, I took them with me. I tried not to look back at the mannequin and the mechanisms that created the illusion of movement and life. These mechanisms were perhaps customizable to create certain effects, or they could just be part of an old test system. When I finally found a way out of the shelter, I felt incredibly relieved. I climbed outside, breathing in the fresh air and refreshed in the daylight. Everything that had seemed so menacing and gloomy in the darkness now looked like just an old, neglected building. I took all my materials to the editorial office and showed them to my superiors. We decided that these findings would be used to create an article about abandoned laboratories and their history. It was an important discovery, but it didn't contain anything supernatural. It was just a place that was forgotten and abandoned in a hurry.